you know, we lived literally across the street from each other. And then I would see her at the grocery store, and it would be like she was ignoring me, you know, she's avoiding me. And I was like, oh man, she just really does not want to illustrate this book. And I just wish she could tell me no. And that would be totally okay. You know, that's fine. So I kept not seeing her. And then the book was accepted, much to my surprise. You know, the second place I sent it to said, yes, we'd like to publish it. And so I sent her an email and said, if you really would like to illustrate this, now would probably be a good time, you know, not to rush you or anything. So I thought she was just going to blow me off. And then she sent this file of just gorgeous illustrations that I really loved. And she said, I hope it's okay that I made Hulga kind of look like Flannery. And I was like, yes, that's the whole point. So that was a nice bonus for me for the book. And she did this illustration for the cover. I asked her, you know, to do kind of the wolf image with Flannery. And so I was really delighted about that. Can you go to the next slide?
Sure.
So speaking of the NEH Institute, I got this print by Barry Moser when I was there, and it's on my office wall now. Kind of intimidating to have Flannery looking down at you while you're trying to write, but she keeps me honest, I think. And I just love Barry Moser's work. You know, he did an illustrated edition of the Bible, which is amazing if you ever get a chance to see that. So this whole project started when I was actually an undergrad at Florida State University. And I had written a poem called Flannery O'Connor's Peacocks Go to Heaven After She Dies. It was a super fun poem to write, and then it won a prize. And I hadn't really won any prizes before for writing, so I was like, woo, this is the way to write. I'm going to write a whole, and I told my professor, like, I'm going to write a whole book of poems about Flannery O'Connor. And the only thing you can really say to that is, okay, that sounds good. That's what she said. And so fast forward like 20 years later, I published my first book, and I was like, oh, what should I do next? Oh yeah, I said I was going to write that book of poems about Flannery O'Connor. Let's see how many poems I have. And I had exactly the one. And luckily there was the NEH Institute, and I was able to get back to work on the project. And can you go to the next slide, I believe? It forced me to kind of go back and think about, well, why did I think that was a good idea to begin with? Because, you know, it sure doesn't sound like a good idea. So why did I convince myself to do that? And I started going back through her letters. And of course, around then is when the identity of A was revealed, and kind of who Betty Hester was and what her life was like. And so I became really kind of fascinated by her and her influence on O'Connor as a reader. Like, I really love to think about the relationship between the reader and the writer. And Betty Hester was an amazing reader. Like, there should be awards for reading, just as there are for writing, because she would get like the top prize, I think. She's really incredible. And so I started thinking about that, and also just some of the things that O'Connor was reading herself. I was very fascinated by her library, the resources of being. You know, I loved going through that and seeing her marginalia. Like, I loved her marginalia so much. And one of the favorite things that I came across was Betty Hester loaning a copy of the Simone Weil notebooks to Flannery, and warning her that the margin is for the Holy Ghost. So she's telling her not to write marginalia in her book and to send it back to her clean. So I just love that phrase. And I wrote a poem based with that title. And so that's the first thing I'd like to read, if that's okay. And just make sure I can find it. The margin is for the Holy Ghost. And these sonnets in the book all begin and end with lines from Simone Weil's notebooks. The pain that opens the door is not God, though you worship it and fear it and pray to it with your loose, odd devotion, your stuttering, cross-eyed faith. Were it only a little taller, a little less full in the hips, it wouldn't stun the nuns to silence, burn the priests to fulminate on redness and virginity. The sun you carry low, the woe you carry high. You are 9/10 the heresies you cherish, 1/10 something saintly, beaten, and sly. On your face, love lies garish. You turn off the lights when you look in the mirror and pray. There's a usage for every kind of error. So that poem was actually weirdly fun to write, and I liked it so much I decided to write a whole crown of sonnets based on the lines of Simone Weil, because there's just so many great lines in her notebooks, and I just kept going back to them, and I wanted to find a use for them. And so I wrote the sonnet and the crown of sonnets, which is a series of 7 sonnets that are all interlocked by their beginning and ending lines. And then that was so much fun. I wrote another crown of sonnets using the same lines. And then I just I kept going, and I wrote a third one. And then finally I was like, okay, that's enough. But I was really entertained with the idea that you could mix and match them to create like thousands of different crowns of sonnets. So it was kind of like a choose your own adventure with crowns of sonnets. That's how much of a nerd I am. The next poem I'm going to read is based on that little moment in Good Country People where it just says she lost her leg in a hunting accident when she was 10. This is called How to Lose a Leg. First, you must enter the woods. No, the woods must enter you. So stand very still and think of something else. This is easier if you are a girl, an only child, lonely. If your head is in books, in the clouds, in clouds of books. If you are, right now, thinking about King Midas, not the gold finger of Midas, but the donkey ears. And not King Midas really, but his barber. Not the barber taking off the king's hat, but the barber digging a hole and shouting into it, King Midas has donkey ears. About the itch of those words in your throat. Inside the pockets of your father's field jacket, your hands cup 2 dead quails. Despite the birds, you must not think about guns. You are not sentimental about birds or death. This is why he brings you. Don't think about birds or him. Think only about Midas, about donkey ears. Then, the loudest shot you've ever heard. It is the sound of the ground opening beneath you. It is the birds and the trees and the air shouting you down into the hole. Irene, could you skip ahead to the that person? Thank you. So now I'll just read one of the crowns of sonnets. It's kind of mixed up, kind of jumping all over the book, but it's they form a crown. And it begins with the given lines. There is the nothingness from which we flee, and the nothingness toward which we go. Hell is nothing, God is nothing, and we are the nothing lost between. Out of our pain, we make countries, maps, direction. She has made herself into a map of the red forest, where an albino swallow circles and drops, where boars and bison and roses have made an almost home, but no human ever comes, and none ever will. All of the empty spaces have the outline of someone missing. Her heart, never still, digs its red hole, forcing roots into the absence. There's a picture of Simone. Very serious. And the next one is called Manly Pointer Sonnet. To be rooted in the absence of a definite place, to be not from any place, just from near some place, is to carry always with you this portable altar to the brokenness everyone tries to hide. To know this world is held together only with tape and glue and clumsy stitches, is to be driven from door to door selling snakes ink, is to be the loneliest boy in the lonely world, the last emperor of clarity. The altar grows heavier at each house, all those glass eyes and wooden legs. No one is ever glad to see you. So when you go, you leave them knowing everything Pavlov's dogs and other martyrs know. And the next one is the Misfit sonnet. The Misfit, of course, from The Good Man is hard to find. So it would be really hard to write a book of poetry about O'Connor without mentioning at least the Misfit, at least once. The Misfit sonnet. What Pavlov's dogs and other martyrs know is all some people's ever fit to learn. Obedience never was my cup of tea or coffee. Listen, nobody came along to raise my daddy after he passed. I sat up and watched him. He ain't never moved all that night. I put my hands on him and said, rise, 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 you son of a bitch. Nothing. Just mama crying in the corner, begging me to stop. So I left and kept leaving. That's me there on the side of the road. You think you've gone past, don't you? When I'm done with you, you're gonna know how to give like you're begging. The next one is from another one of her great titles, The Lame Shall Enter First. Everything here is given in the spirit of begging. Hulga, 19, at the drive-in movie theater flea market, drifting among tables carefully arranged with matchbox cars, doilies, kitchen utensils, car tires with rims stacked in solemn but cheerful black columns. Behind each intricate taxonomy is a hard-used human body with eyes that light on Hulga and move on. Oh, theater of matchbox ambitions, you have reconstituted Eden with doilies and kitchen utensils. The 3-story screen above the scene, a billboard for silence, as blank as God. The stories about miracles confuse everything. Just 3 more. This next one is titled There's Wood Enough Within, and that's the first line that Caliban speaks in The Tempest, the monster Caliban. And I had this whole idea that I would create a series of poems about Hulga being in a summer production of The Tempest, and of course she would have played Caliban. It didn't pan out, but this is like the remnant of that idea. And my daughter was in The Tempest the summer when I was writing that. And so I just loved Caliban speeches. So again, an excuse to use a great line. There's wood enough within. The stories about miracles confuse everything. You awake to the wolf of Gubbio licking your hand, St. Francis bringing you breakfast in bed. Your room is a lion's den, and you're Daniel. Your room is a whale, and you're Jonah, Pinocchio, Ahab. The windows disappear, the walls lean in. The walls of Jericho may fall, but not these walls. These walls are trees, and you are where someone loves you best of all. Your room is the woods, and you are only a girl, but a whole girl, a girl without pain, standing still at the edge. Then comes a knock like a flame catching the trees, and you, poor wooden girl, caught as pain opens the door. It would be pretty fun to see Hulga play Caliban, though. I still think that should happen somehow. So many of you probably know that Millersville is a bird sanctuary, and Flannery liked to refer to it as a bird sanctuary and entice her friends to come visit the bird sanctuary. And I love those letters, she's always saying. Come to the bird sanctuary. The pane that opens the door sometimes opens windows too. You lie on the floor as if you're floating on a sea of board. You watch the birds fly in. All you want is for them to pick you clean. Instead, they make nests, lay eggs, raise their feathered young. You pluck out your hair one by one. Blind fingers find each loose thread and pull. You pick yourself clean. The floor is cool and smooth. The air fills with flight patterns and something like happiness in between. A purpose for every kind of error. And then there's one more. Everything that rises. There is a purpose for every kind of error, and you're still asking what yours will be. It is one of your weaknesses that you believe someone or something can spin you into gold. The black dog at the foot of the bed stirs, digs a hole to bury you. Nothing to do but lie still, taste dirt. Nothing will save you from tragedy except comedy, which is worse. Let the ground find a use for your body, which was my home, which was never my home. Let your words sink beneath your tongue, which was my root. Close your eyes now, and let the nothingness from which you flee be the nothingness. And that's the end of the sonnets. I would love to have questions and talk about all things Flannery, all things Hulga.
I think, we don't have anything in the chat yet, so if somebody has some ideas and wants to talk, wave to me in the group chat, or let me see if I can get the whole group up. All right. But one question, Catherine will, let me finish my question, is when you were here with the NEH, did you, Bruce has mentioned several times about sort of Hulga is based on a real life person who lived in the area and was her own person. And yeah. So did you do any investigation of that, or what other things did you do to prepare for this?
I only learned about that through the Flannery O'Connor review after I'd published this book, actually. Maybe I'm a very poor researcher and scholar. But I was delighted that he really fit kind of some of the ideas I had with Hulga. Just that, what a fascinating character. And I really did want Hulga to be, sort of part Simone Weil, part Flannery, part Betty Hester, and part me. And so also part this person who led a pretty incredible life. Went by Pete in Florida, right? Yeah. Just like the lives people managed to carve out for themselves despite the restrictions. Pretty amazing.
Okay, Catherine.
Yes, hi. Okay, Bruce just mentioned R.T. Smith. That's this book. I'm getting all my books out, So this book, and I was looking at the years. I got them at the same time, so I think they came out at the same time, but they didn't. This came out, I think, 3 years before yours, something like that. And of course, Angela O'Donnell recently came out with the book of poetry, Andalusian Hours. So we're seeing here, there are at least 3 poets, at least. I read other poems actually that are somehow based on Flannery. I'm looking over here at my bookshelf that you can't see, and I'm seeing A Good Hard Look by Ann Napolitano, which was fiction. And I myself write creative nonfiction that's inspired by the places where Flannery lived. No, you haven't read any of this, but I write it nonetheless. And I'm just wondering if you could talk about this growing, or maybe it's always been there, but people who are writers themselves, creative writers, who are inspired by, Flannery's characters, her writing, and Flannery herself, her life story that always figures in there. It's just not her characters. It's definitely herself. Particularly Ann Napolitano's book, I'm thinking, Flannery's walking around giving advice and all that kind of thing. So if you could speak to that about artists being particularly influenced in their own writing by O'Connor.
Absolutely. A lot of people have made pilgrimages to Milledgeville, like John Kennedy Toole, a lot of musicians. I was there years before the NEH and before Andalusia was reopened, and snuck over the fence with somebody who actually later won a National Book Award. I won't name names because, but we all, it was me and these two other women, and we were like, we got to go see this place, So she's been a real inspiration, and there's something about seeing that place, which I think for many writers is both the idea of refuge and the idea of prison. And so we can't help but be fascinated by it because it has that duality, like where she managed to do this amazing work. But, of course, most writers now are applying for fellowships and hoping to go on speaking tours or reading tours and get to go a lot of places and do a lot of things. So the thought of being, stuck in the house with your mom without the ability, I was really struck rereading the letters about how hard it was for her to get books, how much she relied on Betty Hester, who lived in Atlanta and had a library card. That was a great life. And so she could be aware of all these things that it took Flannery a lot more effort to get. Yet she still managed to build this amazing network of people and books. And so, I started working on my book when R.T. Smith's book came out. And I thought, oh no, he's already written my book. What am I going to do? And then I read it and I was like, phew, this, that's his Flannery. I can still kind of write my Flannery, which is more, Hulga. Then, it's funny because Simone Weil also has been this huge force in poetry. The one that I knew about was Edward Hirsch's Year of Factory Work, which is a great poem. But then there was Adrienne Rich, and there's just Jory Graham, Anne Carson, a ton of poets who really engaged very deeply with Simone Weil's work. And I had no idea until I started writing my own poems. There's Stephanie Strickland, who wrote a book called The Red Virgin, which was Simone Weil's nickname. So these two women, even though they lived so long ago and lived such short lives, have really created this lasting impact and ripple effect throughout literature. It's really fascinating.
Bruce, you had a few comments and questions sort of connected to what Rita Mae is talking about.
Oh yeah, I mean, and you're already addressing all this, that it's easy for people to be inspired by work in another genre. If you're a poet and all you do is sit around and read poems, you can cause yourself trouble. And God knows if you're a literary critic and all you do is read literary criticism, you're going to cave in some point.
And that was a great thing
so what's inspiring you now, Rita? I mean, are you following another path?
So what's inspiring me now is the question? I am reading The Trials of Lizzie Borden. Have my little paperweight, Lizzie Borden. Because a friend of mine, I met a friend who's running a poetry series, and she mentioned casually, like, oh, I'm reading this book. And I was like, oh, I've always kind of had, this fascination. And just what's interesting to me is how her guilt wasn't really the central question. It was whether you believed she was guilty or not, and how that reflected on each member in that society. And so I'm really fascinated by that. And I just finished, I hope, the revisions on my novel. And so I'm just waiting to hear from my agent. And so that was a ghost story set in West Virginia. And I am kind of at the point where I've been immersed in that for a couple of years. And so I'm going back to this other crazy project that I have, which is taking lines from Emily Dickinson's Index of First Lines and kind of rearranging them to rhyme. And they're just so delightful. Like it just, if I never publish a single one of them, they bring me great joy, I have to say, because her lines are just so funny.
I think it's interesting that your fiction is about ghosts when it seems like all of your work is about ghosts in some ways.
Yeah, I like to say I like collaborating with the dead because they can't tell me no.
I have to cooperate.
Any other comments or questions that people have?
Chat. Don't be shy. I like questions.
As someone who works in the 16th, my field of study is 16th century English literature. So I wrote on the coronas, but for those of you who don't know, crowns of sonnets are called coronas as well. And so how did you come to see that as something that would be valuable for you? I always found it very interestingly enclosing type of structure.
I have to say, you know, I'd been at a few readings where people read crowns, and I always thought they were probably 5 or 6 sonnets too long, really. And so I was pretty definitely never going to write one. There are some excellent crowns of sonnets out there, like Gabby Carvalcaresi's ones in her first book. That's a terrific, and actually helped me kind of think about the structure of this book, because she takes the crown of sonnets and stretches it out to form the armature of the book rather than having them all up against each other. So you get the pleasure of the repeated lines, but they're not like, you know, hard up against each other. So I think that was one of the inspirations for it, but it was really kind of a practical matter of, I love these lines from Simone Weil, and how could I get away with using them over and over and over and over and over again? And that was pretty much how I thought to do that. I mean, unless I wanted to write a whole bunch of villanelles, which I've written one, and I think that's fine.
Tammy, do you have a question, or just?
I was just going to ask if Rita Mae would tell us a little bit more about her novel that's coming out, because I absolutely love ghost stories.
Oh, I have to keep you posted. It's actually based on a house that I stayed in with my sister one summer. The novel itself is set in like mid-70s in West Virginia. But the house was super, super creepy. And all kinds of weird things were happening in there. And I told this story of some of the things that happened at a party when I was a senior fellow to a bunch of the other fellows. And they were just like, oh my God. And one of them in particular just kept saying, you've got to write that down, or I'm going to. If you don't write that story, I'm going to write the story. You know, he would go around telling everybody the story, and he was getting a lot of mileage out of it. And I was like, well, I really should maybe write that story. And then it, you know, became, it's the story of two sisters, and some of the trauma in their family and how it's influenced them both. And then it kind of all comes together when a cousin shows up and they have to deal with him. But there were just things in the house, like there was this attic, and they kept the door locked, but sometimes it would just unlock. And you could go up, and on the 4th stair, it would get super cold, which was really bizarre for an attic. And things like hearing a heartbeat coming from the basement, and just really repeated creepy things. And then when I was working on it, I started asking my sisters kind of what their experience was. I would see like my niece years later, and she'd be like, oh my God, remember that house and how awful it was? I'm like, yeah, I remember. And they finally, the owner gave it to the fire department so they could use it for a test burn house, and they burned it to the ground. And I was like, Yes. I just felt better knowing it was not in the world anymore. So, but I will keep you posted.
Yes, do. I can't wait to read it.
I think it's going to be called Sutter Creek. We'll see.
Okay.
If you were gonna, it sounds like you've moved away from O'Connor. What other characters in O'Connor really spoke to you in your time of studying? I mean, I know you studied her intensively when you were with Bruce and everything. What were the other characters that you've thought about? It would be interesting to find the pieces to that person.
Yeah. When I was there, I was really fascinated with that novel she was working on at the end of her life. Mm-hmm. And really it was so instructive for me as a writer to see the false starts, the dead ends, just reworking the material obsessively. Like, it's hard to imagine doing that with lupus and with a typewriter now. It would be almost unmanageable. I get so frustrated. I couldn't use Word anymore because it just felt like, oh, it's too cumbersome, help me. So I had to go to Scrivener, or I could not have written a novel because, like, I need things to make sense and be made easier. So I was really fascinated with where she was going with that story and that character, because it seemed very autobiographical too. This person who's supposed to be writing stories or whatever and is really writing letters all the time. I don't know where she could have gotten that idea. But I love, oh gosh, Parker's Back is an amazing story. I thought about going back and trying to write from Everything That Rises, because I think there's so much in that story to pull out. Temple of the Holy Ghost, I mean, that's an amazing one. The River, like, I am definitely going to try to come in for that one. I've been thinking lately a lot about Mary Fortune and A Stroke of Good Fortune and the relationship with the grandfather. Just seeing little glimpses of that and other relationships and going, I get what's going on there, and just, Mrs. Turpin, and thinking a lot about Displaced Person, especially after watching Flannery, the documentary. Most of her characters just do stick with, they're like buckshot, a bunch of them get under your skin.
Bruce is going to use that as an intro to his next Flannery O'Connor class. Any other comments or questions?
You guys are too polite.
I'll do Catherine again. Okay.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah, no, I'm just sitting here thinking, of course, you take Hulga, into mind as you write this. And I know when I first read this story, I was so struck with Hulga. And that years later, when I read that, what O'Connor herself had been through, and then she wrote that story just like that, we know it's inspired by her life. And I'm wondering, is that why, so many people, I can't say they relate to Hulga, but they are struck by her. And it's like, once you've read Hulga, you just can't, where there are other characters. And I'm just sitting here thinking, I never really thought about this before. Is it because she's one of the more fully formed female protagonists that we have in O'Connor's work? Or is there something else? Is it just that Flannery's own emotional experience somehow fed into that, even though it's not the same, obviously? But I'm just trying to think, what is it that really draws us to Hulga? So many people, just think about Hulga, you just can't let her go. And obviously you're one of them, and I can really relate to that. So.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think she is, Hulga, Flannery had said, like, if she lived long enough, that's the intro to the book. Sorry about that. If she lived long enough, she wanted to write a novel. about an awkward, intellectual, angular woman approaching God with gritted teeth, and that would sort of be Hulga. And she said, you know, in her letters to Betty Hester about whether Hulga is kind of based on Simone Weil and what they have in common. She's like, well, you know, Simone Weil is too smart. I couldn't dominate her as a character, but I can dominate someone like Hulga. So I think it was this opportunity for her to quote philosophy, which she, you know, there's that great line about how the Mrs. Hopewell couldn't say that her daughter was a philosopher. She could say she's anything else, chemical engineer, but you can't say somebody's a philosopher. So I think she has a way of exposing that relationship, you know, between the mother and the daughter too, which is one of dependence. We definitely see that at the end, even though the scene ends with Hulga left in the hayloft, like, you know, she's going to have to rely on her mother after that. The next scene, if it were written, would be the mother, would involve the mother. So, and I think that humanizes the mother in a way too, that kind of gets to us. It gets past our defenses. Like, it's really fun to make fun of Mrs. Hopewell. And O'Connor has us doing that the whole way through the story. But then at the end, we see how important she is too.
Well, tied to that, can you indulge both Bruce and I really love Pieta with Regina, and Bruce wants you to read Flannery, Are You Grieving? Which are, they come one way after the other.
Sure. Pieta with Regina. As if grief could be made graceful, as if her death finally arriving could give back a mother's arms, to hold the only body you have ever cradled, the body you have forgotten how to cradle and now must bury, the body that will not rise. Though the sound of her one foot hitting the floor is embedded in mornings, or is it just the echo? Then the long pause before the dragging of feet. You live in that pause. You are worn out from listening, from not looking to the doorway where you do not believe you will see her body, but you cannot believe you won't, no matter how you hold your arms. And Irene, I think that's the first time I've read that out loud.
It just makes me want to cry every time I hear it.
Thank you for asking for that.
And then I think Bruce has asked for Flannery, Are You Grieving, which comes next.
Okay. And this uses lines from Gerard Manley Hopkins. Do you see I'm thieving all over the place. Flannery, Are You Grieving? With the wolf's teeth sunk firmly in your organs, his jaws working at your heart all night long, you stop to read Hopkins. Margaret, are you grieving over Golden Grove on leaving? You drag the typewriter to the hospital and proudly report that the doctor says that though you can't work, you can write fiction. You take the pages of Parker's Back and write the final revisions by hand. Leaves like the things of man, you with your fresh thoughts care for, can you? You write brief notes to friends, send a story to Betty in lieu of a letter. Your eyes are nearly swollen shut. Ah, as the heart grows older, it will come to such sights colder. You said the tumor had to go, or you did, and now you know it was both. Alone in your room, you might have been able to laugh at that thought, just once. By and by, nor spare a sigh, though worlds of wanwood leaf meal lie. A man in a white suit is walking down the corridor, and you will be turned over to him. You know he started walking toward you the moment you were born. Your panic rises. And yet you will weep and know why. Now, no matter, child, the name. Sorrow's springs are the same. Your kidneys fail, and you slip into a coma. Nor mouth had, no, nor mind expressed what heart heard of, ghost guessed. I read your last letter slowly. 67 exhausted words from Tarfunk to Rayback. I am sunk in a sorrow that lasts for days. How many times will I turn to that last page? Each time knowing as if for the first time. It is the blight man was born for. It is Margaret you mourn for. So what about that poem, Bruce, made you want to hear it, I guess?
Yeah, mute your ears.
Oh,
Oops.
it's interesting to me to see, you know, how one ends a book of poetry, and I always think there must be something special about the first poem of the book and the last poem of the book, and especially after you have dug into all these, you know, interesting issues that relate to Hulga. You know, you decided to end with the you know, the allusion to Hopkins. That was all, and you read so well. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think you have the inside scoop on poetry books beginning and ending, so you have an unfair advantage.
Well, Ginger has a question now. Ginger, I think I muted you if you have
No, that's okay. Thank you. First, let me just acknowledge that I am a novice here. And so I'm soaking all of this in. I just recently became immersed in Flannery's life and her work. I grew up in South Georgia, so there's so many points of identification there. The question I had, recognizing again, I may not have simply read enough yet. It just seems that much of the literature is focused on her major characters in her short stories. And I find some of the lesser characters to be equally fascinating. And I was thinking of Mary Grace in particular in Revelation. And I know that oftentimes Flannery constructed her characters on friends, on the basis of her friends, or drew some of their personalities into those characters. So I was just wondering, is this an area that I just haven't read enough about yet, or is it an area that is perhaps still ripe for analysis? I just welcome any thoughts on that.
I think there's still so much room for analysis, but Bruce could probably speak to this better. I know, you know, Mary Grace was based partly on, she gave Marriott Lee part ownership in Mary Grace, right? And somebody wrote and said, why did you make her so ugly? And it was a Marriott Lee who said, oh, she did it because she loves her so much. Something like that. But Bruce.
Oh, well, I think, you know, you can go to lots of O'Connor stories and start looking at the minor what are officially the minor characters, and you can say, hey, they're still from O'Connor's world. And you know, Rita was talking about how you think about Good Country People long enough, and you have all of your thoughts about Hulga, and at a certain point you kind of want to go back to her mother and all the things that are going on in her. And we haven't said much about Mrs. Freeman yet, but she's an encyclopedia. You know, she's all sorts of stuff going on in there. And I would say the same thing about Revelation. That, you know, lots of minor characters are really interesting. That's one of my, you know, my gimmicks in the O'Connor course is to, if I'm trying to, you know, get a student to feel like they're able to do something really original, I'll say, okay, become the authority on, you know, one of the characters who seems minor, who doesn't get talked about that much in criticism. Hulga's getting to the point where there's so much criticism about her that it can be, you know, rather daunting. That's part of the reason that I like Rita's book so much is that it's a book of poetry first, but it's also a really good chunk of literary criticism. I mean, the response to the character is so faithful to the spirit of the story, it seems to me, that it will make any attentive reader go back to the story at some point and think about all sorts of issues that might not have seemed that important on the first 50 readings of the of the story itself. When somebody writes a poem or a story or a novel, and a couple of those about O'Connor, they tend to have a rather difficult time with the reviews those books will get. But hey, when it works, I think it's great stuff to read by people who are trying to do literary criticism, not just people who are interested in doing their own creative writing. And of course, when you're writing it, you can't possibly be thinking, oh, I'm going to do this because it's also going to work as a piece of literary criticism, or I'm going to inspire other people to write books that are like this book. No, I can't imagine that you're thinking about stuff like that. It's just that, somebody like me feels really lucky that the book exists. It shows in a whole new way what can be done as a response to literature. Hooray, thank you.
Thank you for saying that, because I was never much good at literary criticism. I was always trying to be like, well, can I do a creative project instead of the final paper or whatever? So yeah, I find that more fun. But Ginger, I really liked your question too about the minor characters, and I think why we, the definition of a minor character, they'll tell you when you start writing fiction or when you're doing literary analysis, it's like a character that doesn't change. They're flat, like they don't have the option of changing. And so they're kind of throwaway. Like the author doesn't spend a lot of time on them and the reader doesn't invest in them too much. But O'Connor, I think, was able to, with just a few brush strokes, really create this whole person. And it's not a throwaway. That if you followed them around, they would get to a point in their story that would be a revelation of some kind, right? I often think about the woman who drank liquor from a mason jar in the novel. It's probably based on Vera in her first novel, in Rosebud, right? It's all mixed up, but it's just a great character, somebody who's true to themselves in their own sort of belligerent way, which I admire.
Deborah, or are you just you're rubbing your eyes, Deborah? Okay. Well, we're almost up to our hour, and I want to thank everybody for coming on a lovely, sunny July afternoon, and thank you, Rita Mae, for reading so well and really kind of letting us into your process as you were working through this. It is very enjoyable.
It's been an absolute delight. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. See you in August.
Stay cool.
Yeah.